I'd just like to welcome everybody and just to say, welcome to the first reading for this year. As many of you are aware, the CLCP is an important public program for the Dalhousie University Archives and Special Collections. And we're continuing to try to get the best writers in Atlantic Canada to read for us as part of this series. This year, again, we're holding, this reading as part of the open house festivities, or on the same day as the open house festivities here at Dalhousie. And as we have in the past couple of years, we're basically using this first reading of the series to honor and to have the Thomas Riddall Prize winner from the Atlantic Canada Book Awards. Linda is our third award-winning author to read for us as a Riddall winner, and we'll continue to strive to get the Riddall winner from the previous year as the reader for this first reading of our series. In doing this, and many of you are aware as well, we do this to highlight the fact that the Dalhousie University Archives and Special Collections holds the Thomas Riddall archives, both his library materials, his manuscripts, letters, photographs, and all the other materials that he created during his life. The collection is maintained and supported by the Thomas Head Riddall Endowment Fund, and this afternoon's reading is sponsored by this fund as well. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker, the 2006 Thomas Riddall Prize winner for novel Scotch River, Linda Little. Linda lives and writes in the North Shore village of River John. She's originally from the Ottawa Valley mill town of Hawkesbury and has lived in Kingston and St. John's before moving to Nova Scotia in 1987. Linda's had two novels published, Strong Hollow and Scotch River, and has published short stories in many reviews and anthologies, including the Antigonish Review, Descant, Matrix, the Journey Prize Anthology, and the Penguin Book of Short Stories by Canadian Women. Her spectacular debut novel, Strong Hollow, was the first book ever to be a finalist for all three major Atlantic Book Prizes and won the Kennard First Book Award in 2002. Scotch River, her second novel about a former rodeo rider rediscovering his past in the Maritimes, has won 3 awards, including the Book of the Year at the Atlantic Book Awards, the Dartmouth Book Award for Fiction, and as mentioned previously, the $10,000 Thomas H. Riddall Atlantic Fiction Prize, the richest prize in Atlantic Canadian literature. Linda is a real force among Nova Scotia writers and the Nova Scotia writing community. She's a member of the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia and is actively involved in many community activities, including the Read by the Sea Literary Festival in River John. In a different capacity, she inspires the new writers community by making guest lecture appearances at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College, and in 2003, she was one of the 3 faculty members to lead the Community of Writers, a writers' retreat in Nova Scotia. So on behalf of the Dalhousie University Archives and Special Collections, I'd like to welcome Linda and all of you to today's reading, and look forward to seeing you at the other CLCP readings in the future. I'll turn it over to Linda. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Boy, hardly recognize myself. You should try it yourself sometime. Get those things. Oh my God, that's me. I'm brilliant. Well, I have this afternoon. Well, thank you all for coming to such a beautiful day. I can't believe anybody's indoors. We're at King's. They're even having a class outside. I have a few little places to read from Scotch River. This is my latest book, and the one that won the Riddall Prize. And the Riddall family also gives the money for that prize. It's cost quite a bit of money to put $10,000 a year out, and that money was donated by Thomas Riddall and is kept by his son Thomas III, who's getting Thomas II very interested. I mean Thomas the Wait now, Thomas the Second and Thomas the Third is getting interested. Thomas the Fourth is only this big. The first little bit I'm going to read is right from the beginning of the book. This fellow here on the cover is supposed to represent the protagonist of the novel, Cass Hutt. I have 4 little sections to read. Cass Hutt could not feel the land beneath his feet. Stone cold sober and reeling around on nothing, as though his flesh speckled out into air, as though ghost legs propped him up. He pulled off his boots at night and ran his hands down his calves, feeling skin on skin, seeking to reassure himself. He rubbed his feet hard, one at a time, ran his palms back and forth over his soles. He massaged his toes until grubby black dirt and pungent boot sweat permeated his hands. He rubbed his hands together, absorbing the smell. On his bunk, he lay back perfectly still, resting on the edge of something dark and dangerous, and fell asleep with his arm draped over his eyes. In the morning, he saddled up and headed out with the others. Sometimes he tried to speak with them like he remembered speaking in years past. When chance allowed, and he knew he could not be observed, he would slip off his horse and pat the ground, rub the earth between his fingers, knock on his boots. He hadn't drunk a drop since he left Tacoma, and still his feet would not touch the ground. And he feared the deadening of his flesh was spreading higher up his calves, its fingers reaching towards his knees. His will had grown heavy and unwieldy and wanted only to sleep. It wasn't just that Lionel was gone. It was that Lionel had taken with him some untouchable, unnameable thing. At night, when Cass dreamed, it was always a falling of water and salt and emptiness. Most of the day they spent cutting heifers, but Cass was useless as a city kid. One of the others rode past, shaking his head. I know you got your troubles, but Christ, you're embarrassing a good horse. The boss, Miss Cass at the corral, sent another ranch hand around with the message. The guy found him stretched out on his bunk, barefoot, forearm covering his face. Casper, is it? Casper Hutt. Fury jerked from the pit of Cass's stomach to his Adam's apple, then fizzled, floated off into empty space. He let his arm fall, turned blank eyes to the man who waved a postcard in the air between them. You got registered mail. That? Of course not. You take this to the post office. You have to sign for it. He handed the notice to Cass. Hey, you sick or something? Cass twitched his shoulder in a move that might have passed as a shrug if he hadn't been lying on his back. He tucked the card into his shirt pocket and buried his eyes behind his arm again, willing the fellow to disappear. Nearly a week passed before Cass managed to prod himself into town. He got a haircut, wandered into a store and bought razor blades and socks, found the post office card in his wallet, and remembered. Curiosity eluded him, but at least he understood he ought to be curious, and that was something. At the Cotton Creek post office, he exchanged his card for a bulky little envelope that he retreated to his truck to open. From the covering letter, he read that old name, Casper Hutt, and his address at the One Bar None. He struggled to pull a few words out of the scramble that followed. Hour 2 April, address, if you, it, thank you. He would ask Lionel. No, he would not. Accompanying the letter were 2 little bundles. One had several sheets of typing stapled inside the cover of heavy green paper. Dead, it said on the front. Was the word dead? Perhaps it was something left him by Lionel. Then another bundle, 4 sheets of lined school paper folded together. Handwriting covered both sides of each sheet, an endless trail of ink looping across, line after line, in an impossible clutter of corners and curves. The paper crumpled and bruised between Cass's rough fingers. He shifted his eyes to the typing again. The more he stared, the more the letters bent and twisted. Sold to, it said. A headache bloomed at his temple. He drove home and stuffed the envelope into the kit bag under his bunk. Several times a day the package crossed his mind. He tried to care and couldn't. He hauled hay to the herd. He pulled calves, and he lay on his bunk and did not care. He was lying on his bunk when his boss, a proud old rodeo man, found him and started in on him with an awkward mixture of kindness and anger. Do I pay you to lie in bed? It's Coleman, for God's sake. Everybody expects to see Cass Hutt, the great bull rider in Coleman. It's practically next door. It's not as though you're doing any good around here. Cass clawed at the edge of his emptiness. With a great shrug of willpower, he tossed his few things into his kit. Didn't take long. Cass lived packed. With the morning light behind him and the air still brittle with the night's chill, he drove west into the hills towards the Coleman Rodeo. His truck had developed a rattle under the hood that he could not be bothered to investigate. He hadn't driven 10 miles when he pulled off the road simply because he could not bear to go on. The hopelessness of the venture overwhelmed him. He no longer belonged to this life. The idea of riding a bull was as preposterous as the idea of taking flight, or of sitting in a truck on a roadside, or of standing on a prairie trying to believe in some dead thing beyond the sky. His eyes slumped to the kit bag on the seat beside him and rested there for minutes, perhaps hours. When his eyes focused again, he pulled the pack to him and rummaged for the buried documents, laid them out before him. Never mind the handwritten pages. The typed bundle he examined again, dated October 15th, 1963. A name and an address. Sold to. He was fairly certain of these words. Perhaps the word on the cover was not dead, but deed. The word river he recognized as well. Another name in the same town listed again. River. No. He looked away before the letters could knit tangles in his head. He repeated the sounds aloud. An odd watering feeling sloshed through him as though his joints were not attached to each other. This had nothing to do with Lionel. He pulled out his wallet and flipped through the empty cellophane windows where family photos were supposed to be kept. He tugged his birth certificate out of its sleeve. Yellow crumbs of dried plastic flaked off and fell into his lap. Carefully, he placed the remnants of the card next to the address on the document. Scotch River, Nova Scotia. So that's how Cass, who's out west in the fictional Cotton Creek, decides to come east to Nova Scotia, where he passed one summer when he was a 15-year-old boy. He gets here and he starts to look into the mystery of this deed. The guy who sold that land is still alive, much to Cass's surprise. So Cass goes around to visit the old guy who originally sold that piece of land. The old farmhouse had been the object of a holding action for many years. Shrubbery and weeds had grown in around the rotting front porch. White paint flaked from the clapboards, but the roof line remained true. The structure stood solid enough. An ancient Dodge pickup sat in the driveway. Cass swung down off the mare and looped her reins around the truck's surprisingly strong bumper. A well-worn path ran to a sturdy step by the kitchen door. The remains of last winter's woodpile lay scattered under a shed roof. Cass knocked. A radio or TV blared inside. He hammered. Eventually, the door opened and an old man, leaning on a cane, peered at him with curiosity. "Angus McCarran?" "Hold it a minute now. Just a minute." The old guy tottered across the room to turn off the television. As Cass had surmised, the old man had abandoned the main house and had moved, bed and all, into the kitchen. The air was close, heavy with the smell of stale bacon grease and liniment and old laundry. A film of neglect coated the windows, the floor, the furniture. Dusty barn clothes still hung on pegs behind the door. "Who are you now? Do I know you?" He swung his cane out in front of him like Zorro and stabbed it into the air towards a kitchen chair in invitation. They both sat. "Cass Hutt is my name. I got this deed." He unfolded it and held it out to the old man. "I wanted to know who you sold this place to." "I'm 92 years old. Got my own teeth. Here, look. I had them carve my initials right into them." He took the teeth out of his mouth and pointed to the inside of the back molars. "They're mine, all right, look." Cass looked. Angus squinted at the deed in his hand. "What's this now? Who'd you say you were?" "Cass Hutt. Hutt!" he yelled. "Hunt? Who's your father?" "Don't know," Cass shrugged. Angus erupted in a braying laugh. "You're not the first one around here with that story. There's enough with that complaint, eh?" Another laugh, then a sudden sobering. "You're not blaming me, are you?" Cass shook his head. He pointed to the deed, to where he had underlined her name. "Do you remember her?" Angus pushed himself to his feet again and tottered off across the room. "I'm 92 this year." He scooped up his eyeglasses and a newspaper off the little table by the armchair and hobbled back, shaking the newspaper. "Look at this. This is what they call news these days. Rural services eroding. Who doesn't know that, for the love of God?" He settled back at the table. "The bootlegger's gone sober. Jackson Bigney, he's given up the business altogether. The nearest fella now is way up the shore. I'd say 10, 15 miles anyway. They don't think about the old folks when they start eroding their rural services. Well, I think about these things. I'll be old soon myself. Would you like a cup of tea there, young fella?" Cass shook his head. He picked up the deed again and pointed. "Do you remember selling this land?" "I know. A man can have too much tea." He pulled a flask out of the front pocket of his baggy trousers. He took a swig and handed it across the table. "You say your name is Hunt?" Angus picked up the deed, put on his glasses, leaned back in his chair, resting his chin on his chest, and appeared to doze off. Cass sighed and drank deeply from the flask. Cass twitched in surprise when the old man shook the deed and spoke. "This is the east field of the old Randall's Crossing place. 50 acres. Long skinny piece, front 30 acres in hay. Seeded it in 56. Clover and Timothy. Back 20 acres had a nice stand of trees, ready to go. Old house there too, I think. 1963, it says here, and that's right. I was cutting the herd back some that year. That's a bit of a distance to go for a couple of loads of hay, eh? So I sold that piece. The strip with the young trees this side of the crossing farm. Oh, it's all grown over now. Nobody bothers with work nowadays. Do you remember her? The woman who bought it? When you're milking a herd of cows, you're working every day. Every day, mind. Who was she? Who was the woman who bought it? Cass roared at him, trying to make himself heard. Who was she? Nobody. Came to the door, just like you. Paid in cash, packed up and drove off before the spring came. Well, what does a girl want with a square of land? Who did she sell the land to? Then those years later came that crowd that bought that old swamp from Willis Henderson. Hippies, eh? Gonna live on goat milk and buckwheat. They had some good ideas, though. Like the women going around with no underclothes. I was ready to go join them. He brayed again. Those fellas couldn't grow nothing but their hair. The woman, Catherine Taylor. Cass poked at her name on the paper. Angus stared at Cass, and Cass stared back. Finally, Angus shuffled to his feet and headed back to his armchair. I'll tell you who was getting a piece of that one, though, and who ended up with the place. That Holmes boy. Peter Holmes's boy. You know, Peter who fished, Ronald's son. Well, that boy of Peter's, not the ones that's his brother's now, the other one. Who? That one who died. Hit his head on a rock. Swimming, some say. His mother's just there in the village, Eleanor. Christ, I used to go to the Anglican Church strawberry tea just to watch the legs on that one. She wanted more than them 3 lads she had. She could have asked me the favor. He sank into his armchair, grinned, and poured another shot of rum down his throat. I wouldn't have minded the bother. Another great laugh. Eleanor Holmes? Right in the village. Cross the bridge there, blue house, big flowers. I never lost a hair on my head till I turned 80. Not a word of a lie. I'm 92 years old this year. Now, what did you say your name was again? But Cass had slipped out the door. Now, the place in question has a young woman named Pipe Holmes, who is Eleanor's granddaughter, living on it. And Pipe is a visual artist. She's a painter. And she's in the middle of painting the inside of this house, all of the inside of this house, with her great-great-grandmother's story. And her great-great-grandmother used to run a grist mill. Cass has been over to the place, and he's walking into this house for the first time. Oh, another of one of the odd things about Pipe is that she will sometimes sign. She knows ALS, American Sign Language, and she will sometimes sign instead of speak or in addition to speak. She's hearing, but she signs. Cass stepped into the house as he had stepped onto the rolling prairie, up over the crest of a ravine or out of a patch of cottonwoods, and there, with the suddenness of awe, was every living thing. The inside-out feeling of knowing everything and nothing all at once, of certainty and insignificance swept over him. It had been so long since he had felt it. This cherry stone, this marble in his palm, the air stilled in his lungs. Not since before the bulls had left him and taken Lionel, not since his feet had refused to meet the ground had he known this thing he could not rope with a word. Cass pulled a hat off his head in reverence. Images loomed and retreated. Perspective altered with each step. This bit, clear and perfect from here, slippery and off-kilter from there. What was it? He knew only that it was wondrous. The work surrounded him, ceiling, walls, floor, engulfed him and drew him in, making him part of the melee. He followed the walls around, his footfalls electric on the animate floor. A tree root that grew into a grave. Is that what it was? One image melted into another. He did not attempt to sort them out, at first for fear they would shed their power. Such a naked yearning splashed across him, and he thought for just a flash of the city men he had known and their crystal desire. He heard her come in, heard the clicking of the dog's toenails on the floor. He turned to her and knew his heart hung open before him. Desperate. Across the room they stared at each other. "What are you doing in my house?" As direct and angry as her exchange with Earl. "How can you make this feel?" he asked, just above a whisper, and knew the question made no sense, but did not know how to alter it. Between the toes of his boots spread a puddle of red, barely brighter than the dirt colors around it. He followed the red up the wall where it flowered in the starkness of a snowbank, blood seeping from a bag of unshelled oats. How could she paint anything as delicate as oats? Blood-soaked oats. He crouched by the bleeding bag, leaned into the wall, momentarily confused. Was it him bleeding here? No, of course not. He waved towards the wall. There was no word. He crossed his arms and held them to his chest as though in one of her signs, but he could no more make an unknown sign than he could find an unknown word. "Good," he said, looking away, knowing he did not have it right. No. Anger had washed off her features, leaving nothing Cass could read. Above her sink sat a jar with restaurant packets of free food, salt, pepper, sugar, ketchup, and mustard. A nearly empty bag of something, flour perhaps, slouched between the jar and a tea tin, then empty shelf. He blinked back in pain, looked to see if he had given himself away, but she averted her own eyes as soon as he raised his. "Beautiful," he said, but that was no closer to what he wanted to say. A tiny smile pried at the corners of her lips. She spread her fingers and circled a palm in front of her face. Beautiful. The painting revolved around some sort of old-fashioned factory. Despite its complexity, he felt as though if he stared long enough, he could grasp the truth in it. He knelt by the donut-shaped stone dominating one half of the house, running his fingers along its cut-in grooves, searching his memory. He had come across these stones before. These stones like the eye of some great stone god. Millstones. Yeah, a flour mill. In the center was a tree? No, well, it was really the chimney rising up through the middle of the house, but she had faced the brick with bark slabs until it resembled a tree, growing up, evolving into a shaft, spreading out in 6 great limbs that became wooden spokes supporting a huge cartwheel gear. On the ceiling above him, the gear's wooden teeth all worn to an irresistible smoothness, meshed with those of smaller cogs. He reached over his head and touched the paint to prove to his eyes that the teeth were painted on, an image sitting flat against the ceiling. On one wall, a tired old workhorse leaned into its collar, and behind a woman's face echoed exhaustion strained through fear. Harvesting, he thought, no haying with everything so green. details blurred, giving the essence of work without the work itself. A woman working, hefting, grinding. Mostly women, but then this face, this partial face, all eyes and forehead. This was a man. And another one over here, familiar but muted with darkness and stretched into the background of the gold wall, golden to bronze with grains, and heavy with something more he couldn't set a name to. And here, the coming of winter with crisp colors taken by brutal cold and ice encroaching on the bottom stair of tumbling water. Everything moved. But of course it did not. It was him that moved, drawn from image to image by a subtle tug of season, a greater passage of time, in an almost irresistible path around the central chimney, following clockwise the circumference of the giant ring gear overhead. He absorbed the images, let them rain around him. She had lined all this up, pulled it together close enough to see it all at once, to puzzle over. She had painted herself a chance to search for a bit of sense in it all. The answer slid under his skin and waited. The woman behind the horse at the hopper full of grain, bent under the weight of a sack, she was the main one, but there were others. A girl ground up and spit out. Could that be true? Another girl looking into a blank corner of the house. The work was not yet finished. This painter girl, Murray Holmes's girl, was younger than him, could never have seen these people, but something in her made a single thing, a life of all of this. A word shimmered just beyond his reach. He started another tour of the work. Story. She had found the story in it. Now, a little later on, Pipe is thinking about that visit that she had had from Cass. Pipe did not intend to think of Cass, but repeatedly found him with her as she emerged from unguarded moments. There was such self-containment about him. He rode a horse as though it were part of him, and wore that hat as though it were the normal thing to be moseying around like a movie cowboy. He wasn't flaunting his difference. It was as though he hadn't really noticed it. He dismissed her uncle with a single deed instead of endless circles of argument. True, he had walked into her house without invitation when her back was turned. True, it was a brazen act, and he had no right, and he simply disregarded her property and her privacy. It was important to remember this, and to remember how her anger had flared when she realized he had disappeared from her yard, but the awe in his face, the wonder in his eyes, like a child mesmerized by a magician, the undisguised adoration of her work had brought her up short. She could have easily run him out of there. It was only her hand on Blackwood's head that had kept the dog restrained by her side. Cass was the first person to step into the work, to truly see it and understand the magnitude of it, even with it incomplete, and strands of story hanging loose. She had not admitted to herself, until she saw the amazement on Cass's face, how much she yearned for approbation. Made her cringe in embarrassment, but she could not deny it, and there was the crux of the thing right there. She was dependent on the opinions of others, and he was not. He seemed to have achieved perfect solitude, not plagued by anger or loneliness or isolation as she was. He was not without uncertainty, not fearless. In fact, she had seen the lightning flash of fear in his eyes before he asked her to draw him. It had startled her, alarmed her, made her momentarily afraid herself, before she realized the source of the fear lay inside him and was not anything that could touch her. And there it was again. She was too much affected by those around her. See fear, be afraid. She was too much wounded by what was said, spent too much energy running for cover. The world was full of people with knives drawn on her, but whenever she grabbed for a weapon herself, she caught the blade and not the handle. Every refuge twisted into an isolation chamber. No solitary without confinement. Her American Sign Language was a perfect example. She'd been just a kid then, 15 years old. Long after the accident, forced into another Help the Troubled Teens camp weekend by her Uncle Ben, Pipe had been hiding out in a cabin when a square, silent girl walked in and pulled something off her head, something from her ears attached to some small packet. She faced Pipe with defiance, making a sign like a slam, one open hand dropping to meet the other like a wall closing between them. Hatta! Pipe watched in confusion as the girl whipped her hands around a bit, then folded her arms across her chest. She was deaf. She had taken off her hearing aids. Hatta! Shut up. Pipe repeated the gesture over and over, her eyebrows knit with anger. Such a satisfying thing to do, this shouting out in silence. She was seized with envy that this girl could pull off her ears and fling them in a bag. Never have to listen to anything anyone said, never have to hear gossip or taunts or nasty opinions. This would be the perfect world. Here was a girl hollering at the top of her hands and those around her powerless in the face of her anger. Pipe had mimed plucking the ears off her own head and dropping them into an imaginary garbage can while the girl laughed. It turned out that there were sign language classes at the community college in the evenings. With these and her new friend to show her the way, Pipe entered the world of this beautiful silent language. Now she could weave a voiceless space around herself, a nest of breezes and birdsong, twigs and leaves and the whisper of far-off automobiles. She could rest in the soft cloister of a language without the clatter of speech. But she knew this was only half the story. At the thought of locking horns with her Granny Eleanor, or Earl, or any of them, she would revert to the hostile genesis of her attraction to the language. She would become angry and sullen and helpless in the face of it, a teenager again and forever.
Wow. A child mesmerized by a magician. I think that's what we've all been through this entire reading. And that is what good writing sounds like, folks. Yes, I've told Linda that if anybody would like to ask her any questions, now would be the time to do it. Linda's a teacher, so she's used to standing behind a podium and being asked questions. You know, the meaning of life, so not going to throw her. Actually, Linda, I was going to ask you to tell them the story that you just told me about how you sort of got started writing and what finally turned the corner for you, because I found that quite interesting.
Oh, yeah, we were talking about government funding as, well, wherever two or more are gathered, eh? And
Canada Council.
yes, I had just been writing short stories for a little while around the beginning of the 90s, just as a hobby, and I had applied. At that time, Canada Council had a program called Literary Development, and you didn't have to have published in order to get the funding. I applied for one of those because a friend of mine was doing it, and I got the money. I was completely astounded. They send you a check for $10,000 in the mail. So I was telling Tina that I took it to the bank and they had the good manners to do a double take when they saw the $10,000 check. So that winter I didn't do I used to do contract work, and I didn't do a contract. I stayed home and wrote, and that was really where I got my first novel, Strong Hollow. Came out of that one.
Every writer's dream.
Yeah, it was
Would be.
gorgeous. Yeah, that program isn't in there anymore.
now there's our Canada Council funding for this reading series, unfortunately, too, so you're not the only ones.
Yeah.
Luckily,
Yeah.
it's not stopping her from doing any more writing.
Yeah.
so.
No, I'm sure that, I'm sure they do the best they can with money they have, but
No,
it
current
doesn't.
government isn't
Yeah.
exactly encouraging that kind of thing, so
Yeah.
not a good climate to be in right now. So. Did anybody have any questions for Linda or comments about the book or anything that they wanted to say?
Actually, I just wanted to mention that I guess your teaching background must come in handy when you're doing sessions like this, because I noticed the whole performance element in your presentation.
I'm not a trained teacher. I'm not a trained anything, as it turns out. But I teach at just in the fall at the Agricultural College in Truro, and I teach a course in literature, and I teach composition, which is how to write a paper. So if anyone wants to know how to do a term paper, I take all those questions. But that just means I'm trained in assuming that everyone's hanging on my every word.
All we were today.
As it turns out, when you get the papers, they weren't hanging on your every word. What am I talking to myself up here, I think?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say, if the writing and teaching ever pall, Linda, you've got a career as an actress this year.
This is what I need is another career that pays nothing, right?
It's all on the artistic.
Yes, or most.
I found that, I was trying to think of that image of the house being painted with a story. I just find that an absolutely fascinating image. And I'm sorry, it's reminding me of something, but my brain is Googling it right now, so the neurons I can't remember what it is. I'm thinking also of, did you ever read Timothy Findley's Inside Memory?
Oh, did I read Timothy Findley? I can't believe you asked me. That was the last book I read before I became a writer.
Oh my God. So is that a good or a bad
That's
thing?
yeah. Yes, I
Did that inspire
Inside-
you?
I don't know how,
Okay.
but it did.
Yeah,
It did.
okay.
After I read that book, I bought a computer.
Okay.
And started to write short stories.
Okay.
I think it was the way that he would take you right up to something, and then there would be a new chapter, right? And then I thought, no, I wanted that bit between there. That bit.
Do you remember the image where he's talking about the handprint on the cave?
Yeah.
There's a handprint on the wall of a cave from, I don't know, millennia ago, and how people need to leave an imprint of their lives, the story of their lives, and that was all the person could do, was to put his handprint, I am here, I exist, I am here, sort of thing. Maybe that's the image that was coming to my mind. But where did that concept come from for you, that house painted inside with the story?
Probably from a lot of different things, but I do remember seeing in a Harrowsmith article a long time ago. There's a Nova Scotia artist, and you can probably tell me what her name is. Lindy Klimo? Do you know who I mean? Lindy
Sounds vaguely familiar.
Klimo.
C-L-I-M-O?
Yes, Jonathan. You know Jonathan
Yes.
Campbell's wife.
Yes, he read for us.
Yes,
That's
that's
why I
what
know
I
that
know. So
name.
yes, this Nova Scotia. Yes, you know.
6 degrees of separation. Yeah,
Her.
Jonathan, I don't know her, but Jonathan did a reading for us. That's why I know her name. Lindy Klimo. Okay, yep.
But at that time, I think she was living in Prince Edward Island. Anyway, in that Harrowsmith article, she had doors, and she paints this kind of a porcelain look. She had a lot of farm animals in these, and in the panels of the doors, she had the animals so they looked like the sheep was just about ready to come into the kitchen, right? You could just, as if there was no panel there,
Yeah.
but there was a sheep on the other side of the door. Or, and then up the, you would see the top of the horse or the cow, higher up, and so it looked like the animals were standing right through that. I thought, no, that's cool. That I want. But I think maybe that image has stayed with me. I thought, man, you could do the whole thing. And I worked in a grist mill, Balmoral grist mill. I worked there for about eight summers. It's gorgeous down under there. It's like It's like being inside a watch. It's big, beautiful wooden gears that gear into each other. That that spur wheel, that's what Cass is talking about, that's overhead, is it's about 10 feet in diameter. It's a great big thing. And then there's these other little ones called stone nuts that you can engage in and out of the teeth of the big one to make this stone or that stone go, depending on what you, how many of them, which ones you engage and disengage. I thought, oh, she could paint the whole thing.
That's fantastic. It's a very striking image.
And then I took a little drawing class because I thought, oh, I should find out what it feels like to paint. Desperate is what. So yeah, I never got as far as the painting, but the drawing was really, it was very, very neat to try it out and what it feels like.
See, this is what
Is
makes good writing, is when this is beyond research, obviously. You hear about writers doing historical research, but actually giving that kind of thing a try, it's fantastic.
It'd be gorgeous, and you can see that people, those people that say everyone can draw, anyone can draw.
Well, anyone can draw, but not anyone can draw well.
But it's there's some things that you can learn, and then after that you practice it. And I mean, who'd have thought? Who'd have thought? It's true. You learn a way to look, and you learn these like 5 rules, and then you just practice it. It's the same. Anybody can write. Same
Sounds like a
thing.
challenge.
Same thing. There's these 5 rules, and then away you go.
I think it's a little
There's
bit
one
more
thing.
complicated than that. Anyway, Linda, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so
Wow.
very much.
It's been my pleasure.
And
Thank you.
I'm sure if anybody wants to, stay and have a chat with Linda, she'd be more than